Good evening and welcome to our Wednesday night book study. We are currently studying Alexander Christianopoulos' book, Christian Anarchism, which started as his doctoral thesis and became a book. The intention was to kind of collect in one place all the writings that Christian anarchists have been doing over time. This book study is one of two outreaches that we do here at New Covenant House. On Tuesday nights we discuss monastic intentional communities in general and as it pertains to us specifically. So if you want to come back here on Tuesday, we can introduce you to that as well. But tonight we are kind of finishing up the first chapter. We have a few more items to do, such as Jesus' explanation that he's fulfilling the law, he's not abandoning it, and then we are going to look at what that means for us in our real life. He calls it the manifesto for the Sermon on the Mount is the manifesto for Christian anarchists. So tonight we're just tidying up a couple of loose ends. We have gone through most of the important points that Jesus is making in the Sermon on the Mount. Today we're going to be talking about, first of all, command not to be angry. And there's one other command that he makes is not to commit adultery. But there's not much talk about that one. And then there's a few other things we want to discuss. First of all, so do not be angry. It comes from a passage in Matthew 5, verses 21 to 26. And I'm just going to read it here. It's from the King James Version, so bear with me. But the reason why we are doing it from the King James Version is that Tolstoy used the King James Version when he wrote his texts. So that's why we're using that one. And there's actually one little thing that I want to come in onto here in verse 22. But let me read down there first. Ye have heard that it was said by them of old time, Thou shalt not kill, and whosoever shall kill shall be in danger of judgment. But I say unto you that whosoever is angry with his brother without a cause, and I'm going to stop right there, because the words without a cause do not appear in modern Bible translations. And that is a quirk that is unique to the King James Version. The King James Version was actually a translation of some Latin texts that are much newer than the Greek manuscripts that we have today. So that is why we know for sure that the words without a cause have been added by clerks along the way somehow when the King James Version was established. I'm not sure when that happened, but it's relatively recently. The Middle Ages or something like that. Definitely not anywhere near the time of Jesus. So that was like a little quirk there we have. There's actually, somebody made a series of talks about how we got the Bible, and that's how I know that. And it's also in one of the footnotes in the books here. But yeah, that's a little thing about the King James Version. So that's why I recommend not to use the King James Version whenever possible. But I say unto you that whosoever is angry with his brother without a cause shall be in danger of the judgment, and whosoever shall say to his brother, Raca, shall be in danger of the council. But whosoever shall say, Thou fool, shall be in danger of hellfire. Therefore, if thou bring thy gift to the altar, and there remember that thy brother hath aught against thee, leave there thy gift before the altar, and go thy way. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come and offer your gift. Agree with thine adversary quickly, whilst thou art in the way with him, lest at any time the adversary deliver thee to the judge, and the judge deliver thee to the officer, and thou be cast into prison. Verily I say unto you, thou shalt by no means come out thence till thou hast paid the uttermost farthing. Another thing about the King James Bible is that it uses thou and thee, and some people who are familiar with Quakers know that until very few Quakers still do that, but until relatively recently, they call each other thou and thee. And the reason for that is that the English language has changed. In the old days, there was a difference between first person you and second person you singular and second person plural you. And we have the same in French, and definitely in French, where if you want to be polite to somebody, or you would call them you, which is the plural form of the preposition there. Is it preposition? I'm not sure. But anyway, you call them you in the plural. In English, modern English, we only have you in both plural and singular. But in old days, they had thou as the singular and you as the plural. So it was polite to call people you. But not that Quakers were not polite, they just didn't want to discriminate. They didn't want to treat anybody differently, so the nobility had this idea that they were more worth than they were, so they demanded that they should call them you. But the Quakers refused and called them thou, because that made everyone equal. So that we think that now, many of us think that because it's in the King James Bible and it's old, and it's this thou and thee is more reverential, but it's not. It's actually to the opposite. That's the case. So that's just a little quirk about that. But we're getting away from what we were supposed to talk about. So this idea that you're not supposed to be angry. So there are some disagreements on that among Christian anarchists. For example, Yoder and Ellul, I think, talk about this idea that it's not the killing of somebody that's the problem. The underlying problem is the anger that causes you to kill somebody. So because anger is a feeling, you can't really not be angry when you're being treated unfairly, for example. Tolstoy talks about cultivating forgiveness. So when you become angry, you should forgive instead of attacking. And Tolstoy also talks about a little bit about this raka and fool business. And he says that Jesus wants peace and equality among human beings, and that is why he is frowning upon anger and discrimination, because, as Crosby argues, brotherly love is imperiled by standing aloof from others, by refusing to recognize them as equals. So whenever, according to Tolstoy, Jesus' point is therefore to identify typical justifications for anger. So I think the psychologists will tell you that if you feel anger welling up in you, you have to kind of redirect your anger and do something different than you would normally do, which is to attack. And that's how people get killed. And that's not good. Then there are other anarchists who say that anger is actually good because it drives a healthy concentration of energy. On one hand, and then on the other hand, there's another kind of anger which is dangerous because it is violent and murderous. But that position is not based on these verses that we just read from the Bible. So, and then we come to Dave Andrews. We remember Dave Andrews from our previous book study, Plan B, where he talked about Blessed are the meek, where he says Jesus actually does not forbid being angry because you can't really do that, because it's a feeling that comes whether you want it to or not. So Andrews goes as far as calling it a Christian and unbiblical and non-Christian. So what Andrews is saying is that when we become angry, then we need to redirect our anger into something constructive, something that will rectify the situation, whatever it is. It is not appropriate to just back away. I think Tolstoy is a bit in that camp where he's talking about forgiveness, but Andrews is talking about redirecting and prescribing an appropriate behavior for when you become angry. And Andrews also talks about this, that anger is part of that vicious cycle of violence that he's also talking about in the Beatitudes. So enough about that. And then the next one is the other commandment that Jesus is giving is not to commit adultery. And anarchists don't really deal with that too much because it doesn't really pertain. Anarchists' big idea is that the state, whenever the state is involved, it's violent and it's undesirable. But adultery doesn't really have anything to do with the state. So they don't say a whole lot of that. Only Tolstoy is the only one who says something. And the reason he's saying something is because he was seriously at odds with the church. And they actually kicked him out at some point. So, enough about that. And then the next one is seeking not to seek praise, and the Christian anarchists don't say much about that either. Except that there may be Tolstoy again is saying about the church leaders who are hypocritical and trying to draw attention to themselves. So, enough about that. And then we talked a little bit about the Beatitudes. We already did that a little bit when we talked about Dave Andrews' position on not to be angry. Again, anarchists don't really, they cite these verses, but they don't really dig into it, except Andrews, who wrote this book, Plan B. So, and when they do, it's just an illustration of their criticism of public and ecclesiastical officials, as the book says. And they typically regard the Beatitudes as a synopsis of the Sermon on the Mount, and like a summary, the whole thing. Yeah, I think we'll just skip over that. So, and then the last 2 points that he's making. One is about not to worry about security, where the Bible talks about the lilies and the birds. They don't do anything; they still get their needs met. And there are some views on that, and I think one of the more significant here is Dorothy Day from the Catholic Workers Cooperatives, because she is seriously allergic to the state. So, and what she says is, they interprets it to mean that people should not worry about security all the time. The very worry which leads them to further empower the state in the hope that it will guarantee this sought after security. So, if you are seeking security, and you'll typically turn to the state for that security. But in Dorothy Day's view, that further empowers the state when you begin to rely on the state for your needs. I don't know if I totally agree with that, but she definitely has a point about the state being a force that controls us in some way. But I have been, when I served as a deacon in a church, we had funds that we could use for people in need. But I really don't think that we got that right. We were not able to identify the biggest needs and to channel the funds to where they would do the most good. It was more like who knew who and who was most popular. They got the funds. So I think there needs to be some sort of coordination that really distributes all the money in the right way. And that is also what happened with the first church, when they kind of forgot about the Greek widows, and they kind of elected some people to oversee that whole distribution of food business. So there isn't lots to talk about in that. And the last point that he's making here is that Christians are supposed to be the salt and the light. It's a little bit cryptic for most people who are not familiar with the Bible at all, but the idea is that disciples should be the medium by which the salt and the light, that is, so in other words, leave that out. The idea is that the disciples should be the medium by which the message of Jesus should be brought to the world. The disciples are the seeds of Christianity. So they are the salt and the light. And Christians should therefore speak out and not shy away from denouncing the state when it behaves in an unchristian way. So that's what that means. It means that we are also supposed to speak up when we see something that's unjust. Yeah, so that's pretty much all I have for tonight. And then next week we are going to talk about this passage where Jesus says that he hasn't come to destroy the law, but to fulfill it, which is kind of a central point he's making. And then finally, we will talk about what it means for us today. So that means that we're almost at the end of the first chapter of the book. So the question now for me is, do we continue with chapter 2, which is, I think, that is a chapter that for one thing, digs deeper into this relationship that Tolstoy has with the church. And I know that at least up to chapter 5, elaboration on this first chapter that we just did. So if that's what you want to do, let me know either in the comments. If you're listening to this in the recording, you can use the comment to let me know if you want to continue or you want to do something totally different. That would also be okay, but we need to know. That was it for tonight, and I'll see you again next week.